Modern Africa, featuring IES Nantes and Nantes alumnus Ambassador Howard Jeter. My name is Jody Madler, and I am the Executive Director of IES Advancement Alumni Engagement. On behalf of my Alumni Engagement colleagues, Don DeBoard and Jennifer Jerzik, we are so glad you could join us in our virtual event series, which aims to provide moments of joy, connection, learning, and inspiration. Our event today, we know, will fulfill this purpose and more. It is now my honor to introduce you to Dr. Michael Adewumi, who is the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at IES Abroad. Before joining IES, Dr. Adewumi served at Penn State in different roles for more than 3 decades, joining the university with his most recent role being the Vice Provost for Global Programs, in which he provided leadership and oversight for all Penn State's international engagements across the entire university. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Adewumi, and please save your questions, put them in the Q&A. We will have a lively Q&A session at the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody. I want to join Jody in welcoming all of you to this webinar. It is a webinar that I've been looking forward to for some time. And the reason for my looking forward to it is no other than the fact that Ambassador Howard Jeter will be our guest speaker today. He's someone that I have admired for a very long time because of his work in Africa and on behalf of the United States of America. Let me just provide just a few introductions about Mr. Ambassador. I could spend the entire time talking about him, but I wouldn't do that because you haven't come here to hear from me, but from him. So after taking an African Studies class at Morehouse College, studying abroad for a year in IES Nantes, as Judy mentioned, as Merrill Scholar, Ambassador Jeter spent most of his career with the USA Department, living, working on Africa, and actually devoting his career to more than 20 different African countries in the 70s and later. He later served as US Ambassador to both Nigeria and Botswana. His vast knowledge of the continent and of course, life and politics across the African continent have made him a much sought after person to serve on the board of many numerous organizations, international organizations. Joint Ambassador, when we think about Ambassador Jeter, one of the things I like to say is that while most ambassadors are political appointees, by design, in fact, Ambassador Jeter is one of the few who have actually been a career diplomat. And that, of course, means that he has true knowledge of the places and the continent and the countries in which he actually served. And as you hear today, you see that he knows exactly what he's talking about, and I'm really looking forward to this event. So the way we plan this is that we'll have some short conversation with the ambassador, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I think we'll start with just a few questions here. Let me begin by asking Mr. Ambassador just to describe his experience in Nantes. Especially you heard that he studied in IES Nantes in France. And it will be interesting for us to hear from Mr. Ambassador himself, how his experience in Nantes specifically impact the trajectory of his career and life in general. Mr. Ambassador.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. And let me just say that I'm delighted to be here and to be with all of you. We have a connection, as it were, and that is IES, which is an organization that I feel very close to. Now, your question about Nantes. I was doing a junior year abroad, sponsored by Morehouse College and Charles Merrill, who provided a fellowship. And during the time that I actually was in Nantes, we had 6 Merrill Scholars from Morehouse College. This is the first time that I've actually had an opportunity to study and live abroad. So you can imagine how that impacted me. A new culture, new language, trying to fit in and get to know people. And the experience is something that I've carried with me throughout my life and throughout my career. That's what we want to do. We want to experience the rest of the world, and that was just the beginning for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I wonder if you can, obviously you spent a lot of time in Africa, and during the introduction, we mentioned the fact that you served in so many different countries. Can you mention briefly or describe briefly what countries you served in, or at least as many as you can remember, because there's so many, and what roles specifically did you play there?
Oh my goodness. Well, my first overseas assignment was in Mozambique, and this was shortly after Mozambique's independence. So we were dealing with an entirely new equation in Southern Africa. I had followed Southern Africa in academia, but to be there on the ground at a time when this country was struggling to find its way, and also during a time when apartheid was actually at its height. And Mozambique was at the time certainly a neighbor of South Africa, and it hosted the ANC. That led to all kinds of problems, as you can imagine, including incursions into Mozambique from South Africa. On the other hand, Mozambique also hosted ZANU from then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And the same pattern. There were attacks from Rhodesia into Mozambique, and that generated a lot of excitement. But those are the memories from Mozambique. So it's Mozambique, Tanzania, Lesotho, Namibia, just after independence, Botswana, Liberia, and finally, the big kahuna in the room, Nigeria.
Oh my, that is really amazing. In fact, just naming some of the countries that you just named, I'm sure that many of the members of the audience will be fascinated where Lesotho might be, or even some of the other countries for that matter, you know. So,
well, I have some stories.
I'm sure really you can tell some stories. But when you look back about this tremendous experience, and again, as I said before, I knew you from a distance. Your reputation is incredible, you know. So, but in what countries do you think you probably had the most maybe memorable experience? And perhaps you can share maybe a story or two about what those were, how much impact you actually had. I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but we know that you have significant impact in many African countries, really. And so therefore, can you talk about at least maybe one or two, maybe some stories about your experience or your impact in that part of the world?
Okay, great. Well, I've already talked about Mozambique, but one of the other countries where I served that was fascinating and a wonderful experience for me was Tanzania. At that time, Julius Nyerere was president, and Tanzania was the chairman of the frontline states. Now, a lot of people probably don't remember the frontline states, but it was a grouping of countries on the African continent, mostly in Southern Africa, that were working toward the liberation of South Africa. And Tanzania was the focal point for that. There were a lot of folks who were trying to make this reality of a free South Africa, to make it a reality. And so we had just hordes of visitors all the time from the US, but also from the EU and other countries. So that was very exciting. The other most exciting place is Nigeria. And Nigeria is a country that's bursting with energy. Very entrepreneurial people, very engaged in the rest of Africa. I've talked about the frontline states.
Mhm.
Nigeria was a major contributor to the liberation movements. But during my time, it was just after Nigeria had elections after 16 years of military authoritarian rule.
Mhm.
So we had to work all this out. They were building new institutions, new ways of doing things, and we did what we could to help.
Well, there is no question in my mind. Again, I'm going to be partial to this one because I was born and raised in Nigeria. And those days you mentioned were some of the most challenging in the history of the country. There is no question in my mind. And if you ask most Nigerians, they will agree that your role during that time was very crucial because you have literally warring factions, even though they were not literally at war, but warring faction politically who could not agree on many things. And especially the military behind also pulling all kinds of shots. But you managed to bring all kinds of folks together to be able to let democracy become the rule of the land. And how did you do that? I mean, because in fact, many people were even anxious as to whether the military will hand over power eventually, but they did. And thanks to you for all of your efforts over there. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the effort that you made and what kind of skill set do people need to be able to do that kind of work? It's amazing.
Well, you probably are crediting more to me than I deserve. This was a team effort, and in many ways, a whole of government effort in the US, mm-hmm. because we certainly recognize the importance of Nigeria. Some folks may not realize it, but at one point, Nigeria provided over 15% of our oil needs. Mm-hmm. It's the largest producer in Africa, mm-hmm. and we had a special relationship with them for that reason, but also other reasons. Nigeria's size, the fact that it hosted two major religions that were pretty much equal in terms of mm-hmm. population of those religions. And we wanted Nigeria's engagement on the continent. We saw that, for example, in Liberia, mm-hmm. where it was Nigeria that deployed thousands and thousands of troops to try to put a stop to that civil war in that country. So how do you bring people together? You engage. And you try to be balanced, and you try to help people and countries see where their interests are. And often you would find out that between warring parties, mm-hmm. or parties opposing one another, that there was sometimes more commonality than there were differences. Yes. So you try to get to the point where you get them to recognize that commonality. That certainly was the case in Liberia.
That is tremendous. I think one of the things that you managed to do in actually addressing this question is actually connecting the dots, which is really wonderful. In other words, you weren't just going to Africa to do all kinds of things for Africans, which you are, but you're actually acting on the behalf of the US government, really, or in the interest of the United States of America to a large extent. And as you pointed out, there's a reason why you are an ambassador there, because you are trying to represent the interests of the US at the time. And for many of us in this country, we usually don't interact with ambassadors. We probably don't even know what ambassadors do to some extent, or even what the embassies do. We have embassies all over the world, and we have embassy staff who report to the State Department. But the critical link between the US and those countries is usually through the ambassador. So can you describe for the audience, perhaps maybe in a nutshell, what do these embassies actually do?
Okay, well, first of all, an ambassador is the president's representative. It's the president's representative to the country to which that ambassador is sent and where that ambassador will reside. Therefore, you are an incarnation of the president. So you have all of the executive authority, et cetera, and there's actually a letter that's given to each ambassador once you're going out to a new post, a new mission, that lays out what is expected of you. It lays out what your authorities are and so forth. So an ambassador engages with the host country government for the president. So in an embassy, you have different sections. You have the political section, which looks at the political situation on a daily, even minute by minute basis. And you analyze and report back to Washington. So you're preparing a lot of cables. Sometimes they might be about esoteric things. Sometimes there are things that are important that are in the news and on CNN. After the political section, you have the economic section, and they do the same thing. They look at the economy. They look at the dynamics of how that economy is working, and they analyze and report back. You have security officers. You have Marine security detachments, and they do just that. They're responsible for the security of the embassy and the personnel of that embassy. You have the consular section, which sometimes is very controversial, because the consular section is that section that issues non-immigrant visas, as well as immigrant visas, and is responsible for looking after the welfare and well-being of the American resident population in the country where you're serving. Then you have other agencies. You have USAID, you have the Treasury Department, you have the Energy Department. It goes on and on and on. And not to take up too much time, let me just recommend a book that you can get on Amazon. It's called Inside a U.S. Embassy. And it tells you in detail what those embassies do and who's involved in doing the work.
Wow, fascinating, fascinating indeed. Really fascinating.
So I just touched, Michael, I didn't touch all of the agencies and all of that, but
yes,
that book will provide some insights into that.
Yeah, I think it might be, that is wonderful. That's a wonderful summary, but also, obviously you know this, but many of us, when we look at immigrants coming to the US, quote unquote legal immigrants, we often don't understand or appreciate the challenges they go through in order to get to this country. So you mentioned the consulate section, especially the consular section. Can you describe briefly for us the typical the typical process of getting an American visa to come to this country?
Oh my goodness. Well, I've tried to forget a lot of that, but let's take Nigeria, for example. You don't apply for a non-immigrant visa in person. You do the application online. You have thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are trying to get that much sought after appointment so that their credentials or their credibility as non-immigrants can be established. I just finished working on a case for a good friend of mine in Nigeria and Rotary International. Rotary had invited this person to come to the US, San Diego of all places, nice to speak to their group, to their Rotary Club, which is very large. And she went to the embassy, she applied, she got an appointment date for February of next year. Well, the actual event is going to take place next week. So we tried to talk to some friends at the embassy to see if we could get her appointment moved up. And we succeeded. Now, her case was, you've got a very credible, wonderful American organization, as a matter of fact, global organization, involved in this. So it's pretty clear cut. This person is not coming to stay in the US. So those are the kinds of things that people go through, and it's sometimes very difficult. If you go to Lagos, you see a line that's extending much beyond the embassy, across the street, near a lagoon, et cetera, where people are waiting to get, just to get their, go in and get their appointments.
I thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
It's a tough situation sometimes.
Oh yes, I've experienced this myself a long time ago. Yes,
Okay.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, in fact, one can spend 3 days just to try to get it to get into the place to be interviewed. So it's quite a challenge sometimes. You know. So one of the things that you said is that the ambassador, of course, is the spokesperson for the president of the United States.
Yeah.
In any country in which he or she represents, which means that communication, of course, is an integral part of that job, to be able to communicate. And we also know that from looking at your bio, you actually do speak quite a number of languages. So how do these help you in your work? You know?
Well, I speak some French, some Portuguese, some Kiswahili. Language is a key to the essence of a culture. It's the key to the essence of the political dynamic in that country. It's a key to the economy and how it's working. And if you have that language ability, you can speak to the people. You can speak to people who are senior officials in government, even with the president of that country, or you can speak to people in the market. And once you are able to do that, even if for some people, even if it's just a few phrases, how are you, how's the family, how's your work going, et cetera, you can't imagine how appreciated that is. So language is the key. And that's why we, in the State Department, teach over 130 odd languages.
It's really quite, as you said, quite incredible, really, how language can break a whole lot of barriers. In fact, I'm sure you remember the quote by Léopold Senghor of Senegal, who said that the language of the people is an integral part of the culture. Any attempt to deprive them of their language, you are simply depriving them of existence.
Yes, exactly.
You know, it's quite interesting indeed. So one of the reasons why I chose to work at home today, I've been working from the office, but today I chose to work from the home because in a brief meeting that we had at some point to prepare for this session, you told a story about a person behind me. If I can go a little bit to the side, I don't know if you can see that picture.
I see it, yes.
That is a person that was extremely famous. But you had a run with his personality at some point in South Africa. Can you tell us that story? It's a funny story actually, but can tell us that story. That would be great.
Well, I, along with family members, happened to be in Pretoria, South Africa, 2 or 3 days before Mandela's release from Robben Island. Mandela was known in South Africa, but his picture very rarely, if at all, ever appeared in the media establishment. So people didn't know what Mandela actually looked like. They knew he had gray hair. And we were walking down the street in Pretoria, and people would stop and ask me, "Are you Nelson Mandela?" And I had to say, "Sorry, no, I'm not." But I met Mr. Mandela several times thereafter, and I told him this story. I think it was the first time I mentioned it to him was in Botswana. He was coming to make an official visit to the country. And of course, the diplomatic corps was invited to the airport, and he went down the line of diplomats. And when he got to me, I said, "Mr. Mandela, let me tell you a story." And I told him the story about my experience in Pretoria. And he laughed and said, "Well, it is that gray hair," because he had it as well. So
Yeah.
it was nice.
I thought that was a great story. I can assure you that nobody has ever mistaken me for Mr. Mandela, but you had a look. You had a look. That's really wonderful. I want to leave plenty of time for our members of the audience to ask questions, but let me ask you one last question, because I'm sure there are younger folks on this call who might be thinking of a career in the diplomatic corps, like the US State Department, the embassy. So what advice will you give the younger people who might want to follow in your footsteps as a diplomat?
Well, first of all, make up your mind. And if you're very serious about it, start preparing. Read the New York Times every day if you can, because a lot of things that you see in the Times and the Washington Post and so forth, or things that will appear in your written examination to enter the Foreign Service. There's an exam that's given once a year. I believe it's in next month, November. Is given once a year for people aspiring to have a career in the Foreign Service. It used to be that between 20 and 30,000 people took this test.
Wow.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot.
So you're really competing against a lot of people who are well-educated, highly informed, et cetera, et cetera. And once you succeed in passing that written test, then you have the verbal test, and you go before a panel, and they grill you with questions pertaining to embassy operations, et cetera, for up to an hour.
Wow. Or
longer. And you also have to do a desktop exercise. Now, they give you a scenario. Mm-hmm. And you have a role, either as the consular officer, the ambassador, one of the officials in the embassy, and how you react to that situation, to that issue that has occurred. It could be that there's been a military coup. What is the role then the ambassador plays, the deputy chief of mission plays, political section plays, and other agencies within the embassy? So you have to figure out how would you do this, and you're judged on what your answer turns out to be. That's the most direct. And of course, after you do the written and the desktop and the verbal and so forth, you still have the medical exam, the security background checks, and to get into the Foreign Service is a 1 year plus experience or ordeal, however you want to characterize it. But it takes a long time. And it's very detailed. People learn a lot about you and a lot about your life and so forth and so on. So that's one way. Another way that they've come up, and this has basically been something that's been established for minorities. There are several fellowships. There's the Charles Rangel Fellowship. There's the Thomas Pickering. Thomas Pickering is, you probably know, is one of our most celebrated career diplomats.
Yep.
He's served in, I think, 6 different embassies over the course of his career, all very high-profile places. But you've got the Thomas Pickering Fellowship, and you make an application, you apply. If you're qualified, they call you in for an interview. And the interviews, the number of applications, I chaired the selection committee of the Charles Rangel Fellowship, for example. I did that for 3 years. You have to then weed out what you consider are the best candidates to ultimately the same thing, do an interview with the selection board. And finally, there's the Donald Payne Fellowship that's sponsored by AID, and the same procedure. You apply. If you're selected, you go in for an interview, then you go in for the big interview if you are selected among the candidates.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. This is a very fascinating process and definitely a fascinating career. If I were to be a young person again, I would have considered that line of work. But again, we want to leave enough time for questions. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Don, who will be facilitating the Q&A. So Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you both for the conversation that you had. Ambassador Jeter, you have quite a handful of questions lined up, so I hope you are prepared to see how many we get through this afternoon.
Okay.
To start off with,
I'll try to be as brief as I can be.
As brief as you can be. So,
Yeah.
how did your Morehouse experience contribute to your development as a person who could believe that you could overcome all the obstacles that faced Black men in the 60s and 70s?
Oh my goodness, that is a piercing question.
It is.
Morehouse College, for those of you who know it, is an all-male small liberal arts college in Atlanta, Georgia. When I was ready to enter college or university, I applied to one school, and that was Morehouse. If I hadn't gotten into Morehouse, I wouldn't have gone to school, gone to college. And I contrast that with what my children did when they were going to college. It's 15 or 20 different colleges and universities, but I had one. So I knew what I wanted, and Morehouse is very special. Now, when I went there were only about 1,000 students. There are now about between 4,000 and 5,000. But they begin your orientation with an effort to bond the students together. And that's something that you carry on, and it's a sense of pride in the school, a sense of pride in what you do. Benjamin Mays was president when I was at Morehouse, and that in itself was worth the effort of going to college there. To have someone like Benjamin Mays, who is such an inspirational figure. And Morehouse has turned out Martin Luther King, Spike Lee, Sam Jackson, all of these people. And Maynard Jackson was mayor of Atlanta. I could go on, but there's a certain mystique about Morehouse that says you can do anything that you put your mind to. Nothing can stop you. And that's what I took away from the school. That was too long of an answer, but nonetheless.
Yeah, it kind of leads into my next question, so I think it's okay. Someone else asked too, if you wouldn't mind talking about the differences of life at Morehouse during the 60s compared to what it was like when you got to Nantes, France.
Well, Nantes was a much smaller group. You would meet your peers and friends each and every day. You did things together. Morehouse, even though it was small relative to other colleges and universities in the US, was at that time at least 1,000 students. So that's one difference. The other is that all of my courses and classes in Nantes were taught in French. So you had to, do whatever you could do. The goal was to try to learn the language. And I just found both to be different experiences, but very worthwhile.
And now some questions I think that are more government related, past sort of your time at Morehouse. Someone asked, you make us so proud to be a part of the IES abroad community. And in my native country of Colombia, struggling with the implementation of a peace deal and believe this is largely due to the reliance on corrupt political systems and often work against its own people and interests. How do you think something like study abroad and internationalization in more general terms can help future generations of Colombians to garner global support for the rebuilding of a post-conflict society?
It's again, I think it's the cultural thing. And you try to immerse yourself in that culture, whether we're talking about the political culture, the economic culture, or the simple daily culture that you would find in a foreign country. Again, the issue of conflict resolution or mediation or whatever you want to call it, to me boils down to engage, engage, engage. And that's what we did effectively in Liberia. We engaged with everybody. We engaged with the warlords. We engaged with the government. We engaged with the people. We engaged with non-governmental organizations. And if you're able to do that, you're looking for solutions to bring peace to the country. And if you're able to do that, you go a long way, whether it's Colombia or Liberia, doesn't matter.
And then another question was, what first drew you to public service and international work? And what kept you going in this type of work and career for so many years?
For so many years, yes.
So many years.
I loved what I was doing. And when I went to grad school, my goal had been to go to law school. And I had a professor at Morehouse who was my mentor, who said, I don't want you to go to law school. I want you to go to a university and get your PhD and come back to Morehouse and teach. So I was sort of torn between these two things. And when I first started, I went to Columbia University, and I was an international fellow at Columbia. This is from the first year. And they had structured it was a special program for fellows that Columbia had structured. And it's a small group, 20, 25 people at most. And I just got immersed in doing what I was doing. And my focus was on international relations and comparative politics. So I did study up to the PhD level, but I never got the degree itself. And there's a whole host of reasons why I didn't, and I'm sure you're not interested, but I I chose this career path, I think, because of my international experiences. In Nantes with IES, the next year, I decided to go to Africa. And I spent 3 months in Liberia, in a village up in northern Liberia, where the group that I was with was a mini Peace Corps. And we were there to help this rather large village build a motor road that they could use to take their crops. They produced a surplus of rice, but they couldn't get it to market because there was no road. So we were there to help them build a road. And just a wonderful experience through all of that. So, and you got a chance to really immerse yourself in the culture of that country. And I think that had a profound impact on me and my career choices.
We have a question from a Spelman alum and fellow Merrill Scholar, who was wanting to know what was the single most impactful experience that you had while studying abroad with IES that may have helped change how you perceived your place in the world?
You know, when I was in Nantes, we were there during a period of upheaval in France. And it was what some people call a student and labor and farmer rebellion or revolution. So we got to see a part of French history that was in many ways unique. So I would say that the most impactful thing was that experience, being in the country when you had something that important going on.
And what was the impact of student organizations in the African countries that you served in, or their countries' independence from colonial rule? What did that look like?
Could you repeat that question?
The question was, what was the impact of student organizations in the African countries you served on, their countries' independence from colonial rule?
Well, I can't address specifically youth organizations. Is that the?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, they're just one of many organizations for political organizing, and they do have an impact on the country and the country's politics. Africa now has to pay very close attention to its youth population because that population is so large and is so underserved in terms of employment and such things. In Nigeria, for example, youth unemployment is probably between 40 and 50%. If that continues over time, it's bound to have a very impactful, it's going to have a major impact on how the political system and the society of Nigeria evolves in the future.
In terms of, I'm assuming, the voting.
You could see organized and disorganized violence in that context.
Ignoring those populations of large youth.
That's correct, yes.
Let's see, there are quite a few questions here. How greatly has the global pandemic affected the African countries you have worked with?
Well, I think to some extent, Africa has been lucky because you haven't had the major surges of COVID or COVID-19 in those countries that you've had in other places. Still, the level of vaccinations in Nigeria and other places on the continent is very, very low. So the story of COVID in Africa, to my mind, has not yet been told. But so far, it hasn't had a major impact as it has in the United States and other countries around the world. We're lucky.
And then another question was, beyond getting the COVID vaccine more widely distributed, what are a couple of the key issues that you would like the U.S. State Department to focus on?
I mentioned this youth bulge.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that I think has to be addressed. And the State Department has a program called YALI, Young African Leadership Initiative. And they bring over hundreds of up and coming Africa youth and youth leaders to the US for a period of time to serve in internships, mentoring, et cetera, et cetera. And that, I think, has been very impactful. Economic development in general has to be addressed, particularly a greater focus, I think, on agriculture, because without a burgeoning agricultural sector, a country can't feed itself. So, and no country wants to be dependent upon other countries for its food supplies. So we need to get the agricultural sector up and going. And the other big issues are infrastructure. And this is where the Chinese have been very smart and very effective. What they're doing in Africa is they're building infrastructure projects. Sometimes they're roads, sometimes, as in Nigeria, there are airport terminals all over the place. Sometimes there are stadiums, which are, to my mind, it's not the best use of funding, but they do it. And in exchange for that, they're looking for resources. They're looking for mineral resources. They're looking for oil and gas. And that gives them access and influence in those countries. So we can't, I'm not suggesting that the US try to match China project for project, but we've got to get back to helping these countries develop their national infrastructures. We did that 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And for some reason now, the only thing that we focus on is process. Well, you can't see process. You can't eat process. And you can't depend upon process to win friends and influence people in the country where you serve. I remember, and I'll tell this story. I asked a very senior official in Nigeria, what do you think of our aid program? And he said, aid program? You have an aid program here in this country? I said, of course, we're spending $100 million a year. You couldn't see it. You couldn't touch it because it was training here and that. It was this program to oversee corruption, et cetera, et cetera. And to the man in the street, those kinds of projects don't mean very much, if anything at all.
Very, very true. Let's see, we are slowly running out of time. I'll get to as many of these as I can. Someone asked, as the movement of decolonizing different spaces continues to take root, how do you think that will impact how we study the history of African nations, not just through the lens of the nations, but I guess those that colonized them.
Okay, well, I think all of those things have to be studied on an individual basis, decolonization in each individual country where it took place. There have been studies, but certainly not enough. And I think a greater focus on leadership. I remember reading this book about leadership, and the title was, "Do Leaders Make a Difference?" And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So study, 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 and that's a good topic for graduate school.
Very much so. Let's see, I will take maybe one more. Data overwhelmingly indicates a pattern of American students over the last few years avoiding advanced study of global languages at a post-secondary level. In your opinion, what will the impact of that retrenchment regarding linguistic exposure be? And does that insistence on just having monolingualism send the wrong message to the rest of the world?
That is a great question. And the answer is, if you don't study languages, and if the people you're sending overseas to represent you don't speak at least some of the host country language or languages, you're lost. So if you're going to just rely on English, you can get by, because everybody speaks a little English. Some people speak English much better than we do. But the fact remains is that language is the key to understanding cultures. Language is the key to understanding political systems. And just think about it. If you're in a crowded room and everybody's speaking, well, let's say Hausa, one of the major, or Igbo or Yoruba, and if you're not able to speak it, and that's all they're speaking, you can't communicate with them. So language is, I think, absolutely important.
Let's see, I think I'm gonna find one more question here to wrap it up. What would you say to today's college students who are thinking of studying abroad?
Well, choose wisely. And there's so many opportunities now to study abroad. I think when I came through IES back in the 60s, actually, there were a handful of countries where you could go to study. Today, it's just a plethora of countries. So I think that you choose that country where you think learning the language, learning about the culture, et cetera, is going to help you move forward with your career aspirations. That would be my advice.
I think that would be really good advice. So before we finish here, I'm going to briefly turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Jerzak. Before I do that, I want to thank you again, Ambassador Jeter, for spending time with us today. Maybe in another time we can get to part 2 of the questions, because there were a lot.
Okay.
So you've got a fan club out there.
Great.
But
Wonderful.
Jennifer, I will let you end the session for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, and I also want to thank Michael Adewumi and Ambassador Jeter for joining us today. This is actually the beginning of a series of virtual events that we're going to do. We know of 6 IES alums who went on to have careers with the State Department and serve as U.S. ambassadors. So we hope over the course of the next year, 18 months, that we're going to have this type of event. So thank you, Ambassador Jeter, for kicking this off. This was really, really fascinating. I also want to mention that in addition to the Merrill Scholarship, which launched so many Morehouse and Spelman students to study with IES abroad, a group of alumni and friends of IES has come together and created a Merrill Scholarship Fund at IES abroad. And so this will encourage even more students at Morehouse and Spelman to study on IES programs in the future. And I'm going to put a link to that information about that fund and a way to support it in the chat if you are interested in seeing that. So again, thank you for joining us today. It was great to see you all. We do these events about once a month, so keep an eye on your email box for announcements on them. And the recordings of these are all appear on the IES Abroad IES Abroad Alumni YouTube channel. And I think Jody posted a part of that in the chat. So have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again for joining us.